Well, welcome back to the new urbanism. Um, when I first had the idea of offering this course, um, it it was an epiphany really based upon reading about what was going to happen to the Lee property out in the west end of Gainesville. Uh, I had known the Lee family, partied with them over the years, but that was a very long time ago. And I believe the property was bought by Fran Lee's grandfather right after World War II. Um, and they simply held that 4,000 acres until now. And again, reading about the proposed development in the Gainesville Sun inspired me to think further about what a leader um, Alachua County has been nationally in the new urbanism. And I think Jay Reeves talked to you in the second session about Andres Duanes being in Gainesville and wandering the duck pond area. And that gave him many of his ideas, which you see at town of Tioga. So in putting this together, I realized we certainly needed to hear from the county and from county planning. And so Linda Dixon, who is in charge of planning at the university, recommended Jeff Hayes, the county planner, as a speaker. I have not previously known Jeff. I've just learned that uh, I grew up in Jacksonville, came here to UF to school, but started out in wildlife ecology before he moved from Hernando County up to Alachua County, where he's been in, well, he worked his way into planning, really. Um, he will touch upon what may happen with the Lee property. That's still very uncertain, I think, except for the University Golf Course. Uh, but he's going to talk generally about approaches to planning in Alachua County. So, Jeff, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you guys all for getting up and being here this morning. And I will go ahead and jump right into my presentation. So I will touch on a few of the issues with the Lee property that have been in the news, and I'll be able to give an update on where that project is at. But I also want to give sort of a broad overview of where we are in the county and how our comprehensive plan views planning and development in the county, as well as to drill down a little bit to talk about, I knew that the course was on the new urbanism, and talk about how we view traditional neighborhood design at the county. So yes, a little bit more about myself. I'm Jeff Hayes. I am the growth management director for Alachua County. I have been for the last 2 years. I am a graduate of UF, and I did start out in wildlife ecology. So that was my my way in, and I sort of worked in as an environmental planner and really learned that I was doing the environmental reviews on development projects. Found that to be a little bit depressing, because every time I would go out, I would just see what was going to get wiped out on the properties that I was reviewing, and really decided that the best way to have an impact on conserving wild areas and agricultural areas was to actually look at the land use side and the transportation side. So for the last 17 years, I've been at Alachua County and been working in land use and transportation planning. And now, by some stroke, I'm the director. So just a little bit about what we do at Alachua County Growth Management. So this is our mission. It's a little wordy. I'll go ahead and read it. To enhance the quality of life for present and future generations in Alachua County by guiding growth and development through policy development, public participation, and coordination with municipalities and other government agencies, and to provide for the health, safety, and safety of the citizens of the unincorporated Alachua County by ensuring compliance with building codes, land use, zoning, development regulations, nuisance ordinance, and other applicable laws. I do know who it was, one of my predecessors who I know how to hand in writing that, and he was an attorney. So it is a little bit wordy. We also have a vision statement, which I think gets down to the point. to facilitate a built environment that makes the efficient use of land, promotes multimodal transportation, protects natural resources with social equity and economic prosperity, and provides for safe and affordable housing. And that really does touch on, our vision for our work at Alachua County. As is evident in those, just a little bit more about what we do. So you can think about a growth management department. So we handle growth management and planning for the unincorporated area. So there are 9 municipalities in Alachua County. They all have control over land use, zoning, and development within their own jurisdictions. So in the unincorporated area, it's the county organization that is in charge of planning, land use, and zoning, as well as building department. So what we have in the growth management, our biggest part of our department is actually our building division. So that's building permitting, building inspections. We have a comprehensive planning arm, and that's what we're going to spend most of the time talking about today is what we've done in our comprehensive plan. We have a GIS division, that's Geographic Information Systems. So they actually help us with some of the mapping that you'll see and some of our mapping products. And when I end the presentation today, I'll show you a product that we have that's available to the public, and it's pretty fun to look around if you're interested in these topics. But like I said, what I'll spend most of the time talking about this morning is our comprehensive plan. That is our framework document. That is our basic document when it comes to land use policy in the county. Everything that we do grows out of this document. Our last major update for this document was in 2019, and we always have a planning horizon, which carries us out through 2040. And there's been several major iterations, and what I'll talk about this morning is going into some of the major changes and major policy initiatives that the county has taken on over updates really back into the 90s into the early 2000s and into the mid 2000s that have been you can see how they grow on each other to try to reach that vision that I articulated earlier. So one of the primary functions of a comprehensive plan is to actually have a future land use map. And that's what you're seeing here. This is the future land use map for Alachua County. As I mentioned, you'll see, if I can get each of the cities is just sort of grayed out on this map. We do coordinate, we do a lot of interlocal planning and interlocal agreements with the cities to deal with planning issues and provision of services. But in terms of land use, they have control of their own land use. Obviously, the city of Gainesville, here in the center, you've got Alachua and High Springs and Newberry and Archer and Micanopy, Hawthorne, Waldo, and La Crosse, or Lake Crosse, as some folks up there call it. So a couple of major things I want to talk about on this map. You'll see the dark green areas are preservation areas. These are primarily areas that are either owned by the state or in some cases owned by the county through our Alachua County Forever program, which is a program that does buy sensitive ecological lands. You can see that this is the Bar Hammock, Levy Lake area that's actually owned by the county, but you see Paynes Prairie to the southeast of the city. So all of those dark green areas, San Falasco Hammock, all of those dark green areas are actually permanent preservation areas in the county. The light green areas that you see interspersed amongst the smaller cities, that's what we call our rural agricultural future land use. And so what's allowed in those areas are low density residential developments. So that's 1 unit per 5 acres at a maximum density. But really what we're trying to do is encourage the preservation of those areas. For some of them have ecological sensitivity, and we'll get into that with our strategic ecosystem policies, but also the preservation of agricultural economies and the rural lifestyle. So one of our primary tools to do that is we actually have an urban cluster boundary. So you see this boundary that I'm outlining here that's primarily filled with this yellow. We'll get into that a little bit later, which is our low density residential area. But these are the areas where we do provide for urban services. So you have water, sewer, roads, some transit, a bicycle pedestrian network in those areas. Really, and those are the areas that we want to incentivize development in, but try to keep a green belt, an unbroken green belt throughout the county to preserve our agricultural areas as well as aquifer recharge and water quality. There's a lot of other important benefits to maintaining a rural area and not allowing urban development to sprawl out into those areas. And one of the main things we wanted to speak about this morning was the Lee property. And in order to do that, we need to talk about our strategic ecosystem policies that we have at the county. So this is another map that comes from our comprehensive plan. It's pretty busy one. And it's got a lot going on. But as I said, in this map, you see the dark green areas are existing preservation areas. So these are areas that are already in preservation. We have adopted a critical ecological corridor, and that's relation to, if you've seen any of the work that the state's doing on the Florida Wildlife Corridor. This is our critical ecological corridor, our part of that statewide corridor. It's on the east side of the county. But one of the other key policies that we have, and this came into our comprehensive plan in the late 90s and early 2000s, was the adoption of our strategic ecosystems. And so these lighter green areas that you see here are strategic ecosystems. So there's some large ones on the east side of the county that are interspersed in that critical wildlife corridor. And there's a few other ones. And these are areas that were identified through study in the 1980s and 1990s that had critical ecological functions. That the idea was that we needed to, as a county developed, make sure that we maintained the critical ecological functions of these different ecosystems. So the one that we'll talk most in detail about, I just want to show it here while we're on the map, is the Lee property. This is called the Hickory Sink strategic ecosystem. And it's sort of all by its lonesome over here on the west side of the county, but it's got a lot of significant sandhill habitat, as well as very important for aquifer recharge. A couple of the key elements of strategic ecosystem, excuse me. As I said, they were generally mapped after a 1990s study. But in order to develop those areas, we do require a special area study prior to any development. So that's the process that the Lee property and Hickory Sink have been going through, is the special area study process. And that's a more in-depth ground truthing of the resources on the property, because the original studies in the 80s and 90s did not include that type of in-depth study. One of the key, probably the most key element of these strategic ecosystem policies is that they do require 50% of the upland area. So that's not the wetlands. So some of those properties that you saw on that map are very wet on the east side of the county. But they are always interspersed with upland areas. And 50% of those upland areas have to be set aside from development. So that's the key thing that we're looking at when we do these special area studies, is what is the most critical part of the ecosystem, and what part of the ecosystem do we need to preserve. There are some allowances for projects that preserve 100% of strategic ecosystems. If they have strategic ecosystem, they say, we see the strategic ecosystem, we're not going to touch it. They can move on to development plan. And that's the ideal scenario, is that they preserve 100% of the strategic ecosystem. And we do have some examples of that, and I'll point out one later in the presentation. So on to the Hickory Sink and the Lee property. As was mentioned, the Lee property, we've always known about it. It's a rare thing in planning, and as a planner, when you have a property that's in one ownership, especially one as large as the Lee property, that's sort of a blank slate, it's really the best case scenario. Because one of the most difficult things to do is when you're dealing with multiple property owners, or of course, areas that have already been subdivided, platted, split up, it gets very difficult to do anything on a large scale and to have any real impact. So it really is important when we have a situation like this to work collaboratively with the property owner. Of course, they have goals, they have property rights, they have investment-backed expectations for their property, all of those sorts of things. But of course, the whole point of our comprehensive plan is to make sure that the community's vision in the development of the county is maintained through the process. So, you know, we've been dealing with the Lee folks, for the Lee family, for about 2 years. Several different iterations, several different public meetings we've had. And I just point out some of the outcome of that process from a county perspective is They did a lot of analysis. They had consultants go out on the property and ground truth the environmental resources on the property. This is a property that has, like I said, some pretty rare habitat in terms of some of the sandhill habitat, the remnant sandhill habitat. That's dry habitat, but has a lot of rare and threatened species of wildlife that inhabit those areas. It's also an area that has a lot of karst features. So those are sinkholes. Those are direct connections to the Floridan aquifer. So those are areas where we want to protect water quality. There's a pretty impressive cave that's open to the surface on the property. And there's also several large sinkholes on the property. Very, very impressive. And I just point out this one. You can sort of see that, the area has had cattle on it. It's had, they've done row crops in some periods. You see this area that's because that's a very large, I would say Devil's Millhopper scale sinkhole that's on the property. That's, no one's doing any agriculture on that piece of property. But the point of this map really is the outcome of the study was to demonstrate what are the most critical elements, as I said, of the strategic ecosystem to be preserved. And so this is actually a property, I don't know, this is called Flint Rock. This is a rural conservation subdivision. So one of the other policies we have for our rural agricultural area is that if you are doing any subdivision of property over 9 units, you have to cluster that development on 50% of the property. So I'll just use this as an example. This is the Flint Rock property that actually includes all this. This is under development now. So the developed portion of the property will be here, but the preserved portion of the property up to 50% is in this area. So it actually connects an unbroken corridor across these properties when you talk about the Lee property, because the Lees own the property on this side of the road and on this side of the road. And this is Parker Road, runs by Oakmont, the new elementary school, up to Newberry Road. So this is between Archer and Newberry Roads. So the key part of the study, as I said, was determining, and you see that in the green hatch, the area that should basically have no impact. So it's really remnant habitat, making sure there's connectivity to future areas off their property. So that's what you see here, wildlife corridors and connectivity across the Flint Rock property, making sure the significant karst areas are preserved. You see that in these squares. And then you see this orange or salmon cross hatching. That's also significant habitat, strategic ecosystem, but it may be allowed to have some impacts. And we'll talk a little bit about that with what's happening with the property, with the UF golf course. So the latest update, we had a pretty positive community meeting with the Lee family and their representatives and the university. The university's been involved primarily with the hope of developing a new UF golf course, moving away from the one that's currently located on campus. I guess it's not meeting the needs of competitive golf at this point. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had other real estate plans for that property as well. But the latest update is that actually the state of Florida has put the Lee property and put some funds in the budget to purchase at least the west side of Parker Road, which is most of this area, to be run through the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. So IFAS would have control of that, and we'll have to have some more conversations about what's going to happen on the property. But it's really positive that we've already done this part of the study to determine where the critical resources are on the property. So that's where that's at right now. That's in this year's state budget. And this is really through the process we worked on with the Lee family to determine, yes, a golf course development being very, looking at a lot of the water quality components. It is good. UF does have resources and tools available through their academic arm to make sure that the best practices are used on any kind of golf course that's developed on that property. And of course, the county is very interested in making sure that happens, because there is a sensitivity to groundwater and to recharge there. So That's the idea, is that this would be developed as a new golf course. This would be conserved. Probably still some more conversation about this portion of the property. But I think the policies are working, and the strategic ecosystem policies of determining the resources have been very successful in this process. So that's strategic ecosystems. That's the rural agricultural area, and that's the Lee property. I did want to spend a little time this morning drilling down into how the county views traditional neighborhood development and the things that we've done over the last 10 years, really, to incentivize the development of new urbanist types of development. So you're familiar with town of Tioga, you're familiar with the Hale Village Center, and those were our really some great statewide examples of development that happened in the new urbanist way, ways that were walkable, ways that are more human scaled, scaled away from being designed completely around automobiles. But I wanted to point out, as I mentioned, this is a zoom in of our urban cluster, and to sort of set the stage for some of the planning that we were required to do and really needed to do with our comprehensive plan in the 2010 timeframe. So, and this is just for the Lee property, is just outside the urban cluster, just so for a little bit of context. As you can see, there are large unbroken areas of this yellow color, and that's low density residential. And what that allowed in our comprehensive plan was what you'd be very familiar with as a typical suburban scale subdivision. So it's low density residential. It is required to be served by water and sewer. The issue is, when you start to look at a map like this, is you could say, well, what if I live in a home right here? What if I need to get a quart of milk? I have to get in my car. I cannot walk. I could maybe bike. And you see these areas, these are our activity centers, where you see sort of the darker pinks. That's where we had commercial land use and commercial zoning, or in those areas. They're primary at the large intersections, so Archer Road and Tower Road, or up here around the mall, that hadn't been annexed yet by the city. And so, but there are large areas where you are several miles, much longer than a comfortable walk or bike ride, to any kind of commercial use, community use, medical, office visit, whatever you want to say. So that is an issue that we have with our comprehensive plan. And for the town of Tiogas of the world, which is actually located right here, it's in that yellow area, and the Hale Village Center, they had to go through very excessive and conditional processes in order to be able to develop those areas. So it was very difficult. There was a lot of planning, there was a lot of hearings, and what we were looking at in 2010 is to try to figure out a way, if these are the types of development we want to incentivize these development, let's not put them through an approval process that is so extensive. And I use this graphic as a sort of example. This is not in Alachua County, but I think it's it kind of shows the issue, which is that we have, for any area that developed really post World War II and that sort of in the automobile era, a lot of the development was developed around the automobile, not around the person. So when you go to a city in the Northeast that had developed, in the 1800s or the early 1900s, they're very walkable. You can walk around. You feel comfortable walking around because there's a lot of visual interest. The streets are scaled to you, not necessarily to the automobile. But for all development that's happened really from the 50s onward, we have this pattern, which is you have large, of course, this is a shopping mall, a commercial area surrounded by large seas of parking that no one would ever dare, especially in Florida heat, to walk across. You have some auto-oriented uses. You have apartments that are completely separated. You have single-family development that's completely separated. You have large roadways. In order to allow the automobiles to travel to all of these areas, we widened all of our roadways so that made them impassable or not safe or comfortable for someone to walk in. So that's really not an ideal situation. And that's really what a lot of new urbanism is trying to do, is to get back to what we had before we had the automobile, is to allow a more human scale development and a more comfortable development to live in. And there's a lot of benefits, honestly, and I'm sure that you guys have already been learning about them. But what we're trying to get is from something like that to something more like this. And it's not a perfect example, but it's moving in the right direction. This is something that has developed since we've adopted these policies. This is Celebration Point, but it's a mixed use development. So there's single family homes, there's apartments, there's a walkable street grid that's been developed. This is actually a property, I said earlier, this actually did contain strategic ecosystem as well. It's directly east of Lake Kanapaha, and there's a strategic ecosystem associated with the lake. And through the ground truthing process, the developer of Celebration Point, it's kind of hard to tell, but all of this property that was preserved was the strategic ecosystem that was identified on the property. So they preserved 100% of the identified strategic ecosystem. And so they clustered all of that development that was allowed through our comprehensive plan onto the remaining property. But obviously, we know there's a lot of benefits to this type of development. So, it's opportunities for active living. There's a range of housing options. There's the ability for transportation choice. So this is an area that has density that can be served efficiently by public transportation. Of course, we try through our policies to make it a walkable area, to make it easy to walk or bike, etc. So in order to allow that type of development in our comprehensive plan, we had to go through a pretty extensive planning process where we adopted, it was driven a lot by a transportation plan. And I said I was in transportation planning, but so it was called the mobility plan. So it was a way to sort of realize that we needed our land use plan and our transportation plan to be able to work collaboratively together. And so that was a plan. Luckily, it's been successful so far. It was awarded the APA, American Planning Association Award for Excellence in 2011, and was recognized by 1,000 Friends of Florida Better Community Award in 2012. One of the other features of this type of planning and incentivizing dense and more intense land uses actually gets into the fiscal sustainability of the local government and of the county. So this is an example, and I just want to, this is the Strong Towns is the organization. If you're ever interested in looking, they focus on this type of work. And the founder of Strong Towns is an engineer, actually. His name's Charles Marin, who grew up in Brainerd, Minnesota. And this is actually a photo of Brainerd, Minnesota. And this shows really the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that before the automobile, we used to build very densely and intensely, right? You can see all of the activity on the street, all of the multi-story buildings, because you had to walk. You're riding the train, then you're getting on the horse-drawn carriage. But when you're in town, you weren't trying to ride out of town. We wanted to have all of those active uses together. This is actually what that area, that intersection looks like today. So we can see we really devalued land and don't really use it very efficiently through the automobile and the suburban development era. And one of the things that's led to, and this is especially painful for local governments, we have a real issue of that here in Alachua County. We're making progress with our road maintenance. But after we started developing in a suburban pattern, one of the things you recognize is that the developer, in most cases, builds the infrastructure. So the county doesn't pay for the infrastructure. They'll extend the sewer lines. They'll extend at least the roads within their development. So we receive that as a quote unquote asset right away. We have getting a road network built. Unfortunately, for a lot of development that happened in the suburban development period from the 1950s through the 1990s, they weren't really networks of roads. They were cul-de-sacs, and they just ended. So all of the traffic just ended up back on the state road, which then we were forced or coerced into widening, which has diminishing returns. But what you see in this graph actually is ultimately those aren't assets. Those are liabilities. We have to maintain all of that infrastructure. And if you don't have the tax base that's generating revenue for the local government to be able to maintain that infrastructure, it's a bit of a Ponzi scheme, because a roadway lasts 20, 25 years on average, an asphalt road. And as you get to that life cycle, it's fine. It's, you're taking in tax revenue, but as soon as you start having to recycle or to resurface those roads, you start falling off the cliff. And that's what has really happened. And we've seen it pretty evident here in Alachua County from our roadway network, is that we don't have, and people would not stand for the level of taxation that would be necessary to actually maintain the infrastructure that we've been building. And you've really seen that, there was the growth in public and private debt. You see that during that same time period, is that as you start to get through that first life cycle of this development, it's fine. As you get to the second life cycle, you start taking on debt to be able to actually maintain the infrastructure. So one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that we focus on the land that we have as a finite resource. We're not getting any more of it in Alachua County. But what we can do is make sure that as we use land, especially for any kind of urban uses, that we do so productively. And so this really just shows you, this is the just value per acre. This is probably about 10 years old, these numbers. So don't focus on the numbers. The numbers will have changed, but do focus on the length of the lines. So a low density residential down here at the bottom, this is the taxable value. It just doesn't produce that much in taxes to be able to maintain the infrastructure. As you move up the sort of scales, it used to be that community retail or regional retail, your shopping centers, that was the golden goose for local government. Oh yeah, commercial pays its fair share. But in reality, on a per acre basis, not so much. So you really have to start getting into higher density, intensity mixed use. So you see that in downtown Gainesville, this type of this Union Station type of development, that's what really, you have to go vertical in order to be able to maintain the infrastructure that's necessary to support those folks. And that goes into not just the infrastructure, but all of the other services that a local government provides, the police service, the fire service, et cetera. And so when we were adopting these policies in 2010, we adopted some traditional neighborhood development policies and transit-oriented development policies. We weren't getting up to the higher, because the fact of the matter, as I mentioned, we were dealing in the unincorporated area. There's not the demand for that type of land use in the unincorporated area. It was going to a little bit less. There was some meeting of market forces that were looking for suburban type design, but it's still very far outperforming the basic land use that would have been there before. So as I mentioned, we adopted our mobility plan in that 2010 timeframe. We would allow transit-oriented developments and traditional neighborhood developments. And those you could think of basically as your town of Tiogas, your mixed-use developments. We would allow those by right. So in a lot of our land use designations, they wouldn't require a special land use change or a special rezoning or a conditional rezoning to be able to be approved. We would have a set of standards, and they would be a by right approval. We did look at our transportation system, making sure that it was a multimodal system that would be able to provide for bicycle and pedestrian travel, as well as looking at where we needed to make roadway connections, not focus so much on widening roads, but complete our roadway grid. And then look to how, especially in the unincorporated area where we didn't have a lot of transit service, how could we eventually, and we do have a lot of low density development that's already been developed and is not going anywhere, how could we efficiently and fiscally prudently provide for public transportation system? And I'll show a few maps about that. And then we also got into funding. So we do have a fee on all new development that provides for transportation. They're basically impact fees. We call them mobility fee for transportation now, but we have a mobility fee, as well as we have fees for every time there's a new building is built. They pay a one-time fee to provide for that transportation funding, as well as for fire and for parks. We also implemented these tax increment districts, and I'll show that in a little more detail coming up. And then those two funding sources allow us to have a matching funding source for federal and state grants. So that's what's critical about those. As I mentioned in the land use amendments, and you guys have already learned a lot about new urbanism, but it's all of the things that you would know about. It's walkable, it's mixed use, it's human scaled, it's more compact. It has higher density of residential, it has a higher intensity of non-residential allowed, and it's less focus, it's more focus on the urban design and less focus around the automobile. And that's just showing, when we adopted our code, we were really looking to have small blocks. So you have lots of different ways to walk to and from somewhere, and to make sure there's visual interest on the block. So you're not walking, you may have a parking area, but as you walk along the block, you have visual interest as a pedestrian. So, I mean, this is a public shopping center, but it has liner buildings here, and these are all townhomes. This is in Baldwin Park in Orlando. So this was a greenfield, well, it was a redevelopment, a brownfield development really of an old Navy base. But this was not a existing framework of roads that existed. They developed this. So we looked at a lot of some new urbanist development that had been constructed to make sure that whatever we were adopting in our code could also be constructed. And this just makes the same point about the intensity of development and being efficient with land use. So Hale Plantation is a great development, especially the Hale Village Center. If you've ever walked around, it's a great example of new urbanism. Outside of the Hale Village Center, though, Hale Plantation is pretty much, it's a very nice development and subdivision, but it is a low density, residential subdivision by and large. And so this just shows some of the statistics. For the 1,600 acres, there's 37 miles of road. Well, in a Celebration Point, the much greater development intensity is developed on much less land and with much fewer miles of roadway to have to maintain. And so that just really goes down through the categories to show that there's higher non-residential density and intensity. There's some hotels that'll be in Celebration Point. There's higher residential density ultimately once it's finally constructed. And so that's really the kind of metrics that we're trying to look at and incentivize. And I mentioned that we did some tax increment districts. So if you think back to Celebration Point, one of the facilities they had to build was a new overpass over I-75. Very expensive to do that. And what we did is understanding that the impact of having to construct that type of infrastructure that will have a public benefit as well as offering additional way to cross I-75 and not be stuck in traffic on Archer Road. We looked at the fiscal impact of developing under the existing land use, which for Celebration Point was low density residential and some medium density residential. And it actually, when we did the analysis, showed that the county would be $195,000 in the black, after a 20-year, or excuse me, in the red after a 20-year time frame. As it was to develop and as it was approved, we could actually fund a small portion of the tax increment that's generated. So as that land goes from undeveloped to developed, we start collecting ad valorem taxes. And some small portion of that we could actually put towards to reimburse the developer for some of the transportation expenses, knowing that they would be beyond what his mobility fee responsibility would be, and that we would still come out very much in the black here at the end of the day, even after funding some portion of the transportation expenses. As I mentioned, looking at through this planning process, a way that we could have transit service be economical and funded in the county. So this was really looking not to necessarily run public transportation curly queues all through the unincorporated area, but to have some more distinct lines that would run with greater frequency to serve our major destinations and to serve some of these traditional neighborhood developments and transit-oriented developments as they came online. And ultimately, and that's what we've really seen happen, we've seen in the intervening now 14 years, we've seen more traditional neighborhood developments come on and develop along these corridors, which are now allowing, and actually through the mobility fee, funding some of this transit service. So we now just actually last year started having transit service that could run out to Jonesville and allow you, if you didn't want to sit in traffic on Newberry Road, to actually, and you were a professor or staff person at the University of Florida and you lived out in Jonesville, to ride transit into the university. So that's really what we're looking to do. And we're starting to get some higher densities here in our greenfield areas. We don't have a lot of greenfield area. We do have a lot of this urban cluster that's developed, and we want to make sure that we can keep that urban cluster line intact so that we're not removing our agricultural properties and our environmentally sensitive properties. And of course, with transit, we have to coordinate a lot with the city of Gainesville. They run the transit system here, the RTS system. And so we have a really great relationship working with the university, or excuse me, with the city and the university over the years to make sure that we have a transit system and look to do some future planning that is a little more higher quality transit service in terms of, not having to look at a schedule and to figure out when your bus might come by. It's making it more of a rail-like experience. Like a bus rapid transit is one technique where you come out and just like when you're in New York City, you're not looking at when the subway's running, you just go down and you get on it. And that removes a real barrier to a transit system when you have some frequency and on these major routes that there will be a bus coming along very quickly. And of course, the other parts of the transportation system, this map's probably too small and difficult to see, but to connect some of our roadway connections out, and especially in the western area where the roadway grid is not complete. And, one of the things, I actually had to drive out to Archer last night for a meeting at 5:30. I live in Northwest Gainesville, and it's always eye-opening to me to try to drive out to Newberry or to Archer. It's the traffic is bad. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of demand on very few corridors. And so completing that gridded roadway network is really key. I used to live closer to downtown, and even though the density of development is the same, where the grid of the roadway network is complete, you don't have the same types of congestion issues. So looking to complete that gridded roadway network, as well as complete a system of off-road bicycle and pedestrian facilities, multi-use paths to provide that connectivity for residents who could now, as we get commercial uses closer to their residences, will actually be able to bike. And since we did this planning effort, the advent of e-bikes has even extended, the ability for residents to actually get on a bike and use an e-bike and not be a sweaty mess by the time they get to their destination. So. One quick plug, and then I'll take questions, and we might actually use this. I mentioned our GIS division at Growth Management. We have a tool that's available to all the public. It's mapgenius.alachuacounty.us. And this is the property we're sitting on right now at Oak Hammock. But on this left-hand bar, you see when you click on your property, you can get all kinds of information and all kinds of linked public data. Any kind of data that's publicly available on a property, you can get from this website. So, and there's more. You can see where the wetlands are. You can see where the floodplain is. You can look at the aerials. You can look at historic aerials, which is really cool. We have historic aerials on here, and you can go back all the way back to the 1930s and see what the area looked like before it was developed. So. Just a quick plug that's something we're very proud of at the department and is available for free to everyone, all of the public. It works on your phones and it works really well on your computer. So with that, that's my contact information. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that was extremely informative, and I'm impressed with the current approach to planning in the county. I have two unrelated questions. One was clarification. Has that 19 million for acquisition of the rights over the western portion of the Lee property been appropriated, or is it being asked for?
My understanding, and I'm not a complete expert in the dealings of the legislature, is that it was something included on what's called the sprinkle list, which is where members can actually, where the Senate president and House Speaker, they actually have a list that they put on. And my understanding is that it is not subject to line item veto, and it is funded on that list. The budget has not been signed, and that's just my understanding that it's
Okay,
not subject to
okay.
line item veto. I'm
So-
not an expert on that.
so, but it's not subject to line item veto. So likely the funding is there. The other is, how does the county work with ACT in acquiring or preserving parts of the county?
A lot. They're really critical. I would say we function symbiotically because one of the things, this is Alachua Conservation Trust. One of the things, and actually I think this example is true of the property that's right east of this one that the county purchased, Serenola, is that sometimes Alachua Conservation Trust can move quicker on a piece of property when it becomes available. And then the county can then go ahead and purchase it from Alachua Conservation Trust. So the Serenola Forest property that's directly to the east of here was one of those properties, I believe.
All right, open it to questions.
Yeah, I have a personal question, but I think it serves as an example and it addresses a lot of these issues. We built a home that backs up to a few preserved woods, but we basically look at a field. The field is privately owned by a person in town. He leased it for 15 years to a farmer, so we had these gorgeous bulls we looked at for years. The lease ran out. It's now for sale. And our developer had told us years ago that if it was sold and developed, it had to be zoned for 5 acres. So it'd have to switch from agricultural zoning to other zoning. But I happen to know this person is interested in high-density housing for people who live in other areas who could afford to live in Gainesville. It's west on Archer, where so much development is going on and the traffic's getting worse. So there's all these issues involved, and I'm hoping you can kind of enlighten me as to what the heck's going to happen to that property.
Well, this will be, maybe I could grab.
I can go back.
I'll just, good object example for how you can use this website. If you don't mind giving us your, showing us what your property is. But I can, even just the area.
It's in Monterey Village.
Okay.
Across from 91st, across from Hale. And there's a lot of development right west of us.
Is that shared? Is that on Zoom?
I'll share. Yeah, go ahead. Share. Okay, so this is Longleaf, and this is our Map Genius. Is it up there on the screen? Okay. This is our Map Genius software. So what you can do is, one of the things you can do is come here to zoning and future land use, and I'll turn on the future land use layer. So that's correct, basically, is that this is Longleaf is right at the edge of our urban cluster boundary. So all of these properties outside to the southeast surrounding Longleaf are in, was this Willow Oak, are agricultural. So that's 1 unit per 5 acres. So that's all correct. They can't develop higher density land without expanding and extending the urban cluster. And the ability to extend the urban cluster is not impossible, but we make it pretty difficult. And the idea is in order to make sure that we use up all of the property in the urban cluster before we talk about expanding it. And this, as I said, this is our, it has wetlands, you can turn it on, not many wetlands out in this area, strategic ecosystem. You can, all of these things that we've been talking about, you can zoom out and play around. You can look at the historic aerials and
I have a question about, the fact that Gainesville used to be called Tree City. And now we see all these trees being removed, like the corner of Williston Road and 34th Street. About 2 years ago, maybe longer, they took out an entire forest of trees. And what they're doing so far, it's taken them 2 years to get around to it. They're building a car wash. But for 2 years, we haven't seen those trees. And who cares about another car wash?
I'll show this as well. First of all, I'll just say that's all in the city of Gainesville, so I won't speak to the particulars, but I can speak to the issue and some of what we do in terms of tree preservation. So in the county, if you come in for a new development, you have to preserve 20%. So if you're not, we do have some of these habitat classifications that I spoke of earlier, and those are whole different situations, but let's just say it doesn't qualify as significant habitat or strategic ecosystem. You are allowed in the county, you are required to preserve 20% of the existing tree canopy on your development property. In addition, if there are any 60-inch and above long-lived trees like live oaks, you basically have to preserve them, and they can only be removed under very specific circumstances. And even then, we highly incentivize you don't remove them because we have a tree mitigation schedule that gets prohibitively expensive the larger the tree and the more significant the tree is. So, but I understand it is always very striking when, we kind of get used to seeing properties that we're familiar with and that they're beautiful and we know they probably have some wildlife, and then they get knocked down. You see the trees removed. The only thing I'll say, one other thing that we have in the county, after you remove the trees, we require you to have 30% of the site under existing canopy post-development. So you have to come back and replant a lot of trees as well, as paying into a mitigation fund. So it's strongly incentivized for you not to remove trees and to work around the most significant ones. But I will, on just a bigger picture, put a plug in for sometimes when we see trees removed in the urban area, there is some thought process in developing a little bit more intensely, maybe removing a few more trees in the urban area, still replanting trees so that we don't have heat islands and we don't have all of those issues, in order to maintain more of our truly environmentally significant areas that are maybe outside the urbanized area. But I know it's always very upsetting when you see trees removed. And one other thing we have in the county is you can't remove trees in that way prior to their development approval. You can only remove them with your development approval, and then you are expected that you're building at that point.
What's the update with West End?
The update with West End is, and I want to just make sure I'm not speaking out of school, but I can say that the county is at least exploring purchasing that property as a county park in the future. So that's what's been happening. There was a proposal for development of that property. You can see here, this is West End. Future land use for that area is recreation, so there would have to be a future land use change in order to develop it. That was denied by the county commission a year or so ago. And so the current property owner is looking to do something with it. And we're trying to look at ways that the county may be able to purchase it for basically kind of a central park for Jonesville, the Jonesville area as it's developing.
Okay, in the past, new apartment buildings and so forth were required to leave trees in front of them. And now it seems like the apartment buildings are right up to where the sidewalk would be if there were one. And when did that change and why?
So we still require a lot of landscaping. It is sort of there are some competing goals in terms of making areas walkable, as you want to have buildings pushed up to the street, but at the same time, you want to have street trees. So the county requires street trees. So if there are apartments built and they're built up to the street, there will be street trees along the frontage of the apartments as well. What we've gotten away from in planning is large buffered areas so that you don't have to see the apartments. In some cases we have those, but in most cases it's really trying to knit the area together and to still have street trees so that we can have, like I said, not get into heat island and still have a green and softened facades. But there is a goal to push buildings more to the street than there was in the past.
Okay, here.
It seems like there's a development named Terra, and it seems like they wanted to have only 5% of the trees left, and the county commission was considering that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. So that tree preservation requirement, if you are developing as a T&D development, does go down to 5% of the existing tree canopy. That's what's in our code.
You know, it seems like it's long been a policy in Alachua County that you can't get anything done, you know, you can't do this, can't do that. And then all of a sudden, you see a section of land clear cut, like when they were building Celebration Point. And I believe at the same time, there was a lot of clear cutting. I think the back part of Butler and Celebration were being developed at the same time. And so that's always been kind of a question mark in my mind. And another thing, you know, they're building all those apartments at Newberry Road and Parker. And that does not seem to be new urbanism. Maybe it is, but you know, with all of that density there, that just adds to the terrible traffic that's on Newberry Road. And one question is, what is going on at the corner? That would be the northeast corner of 39th and 241.
These are all great questions. I'll start with, this is the apartments on Newberry and 122nd on Parker Road. So what you can see is, and I agree, if you go by there today, it doesn't much look like new urbanism, but as these areas and blocks fill in, that's where we'll start to get this gridded street network. The people who live in the apartments will be able to shop at the Aldi that'll be here, and therefore not have to get in their cars and drive to the Aldi the way they would in the past. And really what we found with density is, one of the things that we found in planning is that when people want to move to Florida, they will, and they will continue to. And if we don't allow density, they will live farther out. They might live in Newberry, but they will still drive in to Gainesville on Newberry Road. And so in a lot of ways, it's very difficult to avoid the traffic impacts because our population growth, no matter what we do with planning, it's very difficult for us to change our population growth. What we do is potentially make it, you know, price people out of certain housing, so they have to drive farther out to Newberry or to Gilchrist County, but they would do that. You bring up a good question about trees. This is where we are. Oh, this is actually a newer aerial. This is where we are somewhat hamstrung at the county when it comes to tree removal. And this is that property you spoke of on the corner of 39th and 241. So the state of Florida, and if I click on here and we go to this parcel and see it says property use timberland site index, that is the property appraisers code. They have an agricultural exemption on the property for silviculture. And so they are allowed to remove those trees without any county permit. and they can remove basically 100, you're supposed to use management practices, but I think other than leaving a little strip along the road, which I'm not even positive they did, they are allowed to remove the trees consistent with their silviculture practice. And the only thing that we can do at the county is if they did come in to develop, we have a 5-year recapture period. They have to wait 5 years so that someone can't use their silviculture exemption, clear the entire property, and then say, okay, I'm ready to develop.
I want to ask a couple of general questions that that relate to the activities of the city of Newberry and the activities of the city of Alachua. They, to me, seem to have been given carte blanche to take over vast swaths of land that bring them right up to Gainesville. I don't exactly know how cities and the county planning work, but it would seem to me that with Alachua coming as far south as 53rd almost, they really have pretty much control over that whole area. And the city of Newberry, sort of what I read in the newspaper, is trying to be essentially similar, where if they don't separate from the county entirely, and invent a new county that is very Western Alachua County-ish, they seem to want to do something like that and have their own schools, have their own control over everything from Jonesville on to Newberry. How does the county feel about those two issues?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So one of the parts of Florida law that is the county in some ways, if cities annex consistent with Florida law, so they can annex unincorporated area property. So you see on this map, this is the gray is the cities, and Newberry is, and they went on a real annexation binge in the 90s and annexed a lot of property, unincorporated area property. In some ways, that was probably not the best because there are rules against creating enclaves and creating pockets, but nevertheless, if they annex consistent with Florida statute, which is they're compact and contiguous and adjacent to their borders, there's not really anything the county can do to stop a city from annexing. What the county has done is we put a ballot measure on the box to get to I think the other point of your question, that was in 2020 or 2022, must have been 22. Ever since COVID, all of my time frames have completely compressed or gone out the window, but we adopted the voters, we put this on the ballot and it was approved in a referendum, the county growth management area. So you see this in that orange color there. There's still area where the cities can annex unincorporated area and they would have land use control. But as they annexed into this orange area, they would not have the same amount of land use control. The county would still have land use control. And so what you see, I mean, several years ago, we had the Envision Alachua project where Weyerhaeuser, which is the timber company, owns large swaths of eastern Alachua County, wanted to come in, but the idea that maybe Hawthorne could come in and annex them and then they would, be able to develop. So the county still controls the land use approvals within this orange area. So as there's annexation into the orange area, we still have our rural agricultural land use, we still have our strategic ecosystem policies, et cetera, to sort of keep that green belt and keep a separation amongst the cities and the city of Gainesville.
To what extent, to what extent is the county percentage-wise, how much of the total area does the county control as opposed to the municipalities?
That's a great question that I probably can't even roll off. You can look at this map and you can sort of eyeball it. We control a larger area than the municipalities. You know, you see our county boundary, which I'm sort of outlining here, and you see the municipal boundaries. We have, you know, there's this large area, much of it, you know, is some of this, everything in the southeast that's owned either by the Water Management District or state parks, through Paynes Prairie and the Alachua area. We have more land areas, probably more than 50%, but it's all rural agriculture. It's not really made for any kind of significant development. So when you look at our urban cluster boundary, if I can turn that on. You know, that's still a pretty large area. You know, you look at that compared to the city of Gainesville, and we have some urban cluster on the east side as well as the west side. And you can see the city limits. So, you know, that's roughly equal. I'm just eyeballing. I'm not looking at any numbers.
So an additional question then is, to what extent are the municipalities operating in a way that's consistent with or coordinated with the county in these efforts for new urbanism? Or is there great disparity, you know, among the different municipal areas?
I would say there is disparity depending on the municipality, because they have complete home rule control over land use, zoning, and development within their boundaries. So depending on the makeup of that city, they are allowed to develop in the way that they see fit.
Let's click on that chat and see what that question
Yep.
is.
Shopping at market will, shopping at grocery or market will use a car. Yes, that's understood. You know, one of the things we've done with our planning too, with trying to bring non-residential uses closer, because as I mentioned, that was started basically as a updating our transportation policies, is actually getting that market closer to you. So even if you are driving, you're not driving 5 miles on Newberry Road, you're driving a mile, a shorter distance, and that will help with traffic as well.
That it? Jeff, I really enjoyed your presentation. I feel I know a lot more now about the direction of county planning. My observation is that our legislature is increasingly preempting what both county and municipal governments can do. So I'm sure that's an additional burden you bear. But thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing what happens with the Lee property as time goes on. So again, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.